Fragility of goodness. A lot of times I talk about the capital letter issues, but this is about what's inside. What do I mean by it today is that when a person tries to live a good life, they can become vulnerable. Trying to live a good life involves deep compassion and caring about many things in a complex and unpredictable world. So nurturing goodness requires trusts, and ill intention can break trust. Bad luck can hurt you, you can ache. Any of us in here can be broken trying to live a good life. Why is this so? It's a question that I've asked a lot, and about 2 decades ago I began to get a little clarity around this issue when reading a book called The Fragility of Goodness by a philosopher named Martha Nussbaum. You can also see her interviewed by Bill Moyers if you Google that. It tied in with my growing awareness of an approach to morality known as the ethics of care, which I'll just touch on today. But all these ideas help me understand the perils of trying to live an ethical life, and I hope it offers you something today. My plan is to first share some observations about fragility and vulnerability and suffering, and then I want to explore some rational and stoic methods that people often use to protect ourselves. And then I want to go to my preferred approach, which is something close to the humanistic ethics of care, where we are open to the suffering of others in an attempt to transform that suffering into a deeply educational and constructive part of living a good life. So that's my plan. Now, the founder of ethical culture, Felix Adler, wrote a lot about sources of 3 spiritual pains. Now, he uses the term spiritual, and really in a lot of ways he means ethical. Sometimes I think of it as emotional pain. What I'm focusing on, I'm going to use the term spiritual, but what I mean is not a physical pain, more of a pain of conscience or emotion. One of the sources of spiritual pain that he talks about is the sense of insignificance of people in this vast universe. We're here for such little time. We take up such little space. We know so little. And that, for him, is a source of spiritual pain. It bothers some people more than others. I think I've gotten over that one. Another source of spiritual pain is that Adler sees a division of our conscience into the public and the private realms of our life. This is something I feel more. We're often torn between our personal needs or our loyalty to a close circle of friends and more global approaches to ethics. Our concrete values so often run counter to our duty or abstract justice, and that can generate some emotional pain. But the source of suffering I want to focus on today is the one that I often mention, and that's the simple realization that millions of people are suffering every day. I use this passage quite often where I want you to picture this. This is something that I often read from an ethical philosophy of life. Adler says that we suffer due to the fate of those innumerable fellow beings who perish by the wayside while mankind slowly and awkwardly tries to achieve progress. I mean those many thousands who are dying unhelped in hospitals. I mean the victims of the foul conditions of the slums. We stand, as it were, on the shore and see multitudes of our fellow beings struggling in the water, stretching forth their arms, sinking, drowning, and we are powerless to assist them. It's not easy to experience that kind of pain from the outside. It can overwhelm us, it can numb us and paralyze us. In fact, Adler talks about it being like looking at the mythical and hideous head of Medusa, with her hair of writhing snakes. He writes, "Whoever looks at her becomes like her. The blood freezes in his veins. He is turned into stone. Prospective pain is the Medusa. We look into the face and are petrified. The reason is we think of the pain and do not look beyond the pain." So many of us can experience this kind of avoidance in life. We're not proud of it when we turn the page to avoid looking at the face of a starving child in a magazine of an Oxfam advertisement. Or maybe we're not proud of the fact that once again we put off going to visit a friend who is dying. We all do this. There's so much need in the world and our time is so limited. We don't want to suffer. We're afraid. We're human. Adler admitted all of this, but his response to spiritual pain was colored by the Calvinist culture that he grew up in Europe and then in his transplanted home in the United States. And Calvinism encourages almost a glorification of suffering. At times, suffering is portrayed as good and righteous in and of itself. Adler writes a lot about this pain. He says it, certainly he believes that pain creates a discipline and an admirable seriousness about life. And it comes close to the model of what's called redemptive suffering. As Christ redeemed the world by taking all the suffering upon himself, Calvinism encourages us to redeem ourselves through suffering. And this becomes very clear when Adler recounts a Swiss legend in his book, An Ethical Philosophy of Life. It's the legend of an Arnold Winkelried, a martyred Swiss hero of the 1386 Battle of Sempak. According to this story, when confronted by Austrian guards, Winkelried willingly took in many enemy spears into his chest, and this sacrifice transformed short-term defeat into long-term victory for the Swiss. Now, Adler struggled all his life to confront and transform the suffering of this broken world, and he immodestly compared himself to Winkelried. He gave himself a starring role in a transformational spiritual martyr. He writes, "I am like Arnold Winkelried, who gathers the sheafs of spears into his breast and even presses them inward to make way for liberty. So do I press the sharp-pointed spears of frustration into my breast to make way for spiritual liberty. For these cruel spears turn into shafts of light, radiating outward, along which my spirit travels, building its final nest, the spiritual universe." It's a beautiful passage. It's too metaphysically idealistic for me. It's a little too melodramatic and, frankly, a little self-promoting. But it does emphasize a common theme in Western ethical and religious literature, the transformation of pain into redemptive power. It's not quite the same as saying that pain is something good in and of itself, but it comes a little close. I mean, personally, I think pain in and of itself is bad. I think by itself, without any other thing connected, we should avoid it and we should encourage others to avoid it. I mean, there's some truth to the phrase, no pain, no gain, but I reject the masochistic glorification of anguish for its own sake. First of all, too often the rich and powerful use it to promote redemptive suffering amongst the poor as a way to control them. I mean, I recoil at the phrase, the meek shall inherit the earth, or the advice that the poor will find their reward in heaven. And this really is sort of clarified to me in a story my wife talks about going to Mexico when she was a child and seeing pilgrims with bloodied knees crawling up the stairs of this gilded cathedral to give their last pesos to a priest in gold robes. I mean, how dare, and this is not just the church, there's a lot of us that do this, but how dare the comfortable rationalize the pain of the marginalized and the poor? For those of us lucky enough to physically be relatively comfortable, we still can confront what this spiritual pain is, this emotional pain, this pain of conscience, especially if we want to be good and caring people. I wrestle with this, and I think some of you do too. Maybe it's better to call this pain something else. Kate Lovelady, the leader of the St. Louis Society, calls it unmet spiritual wants. Or Joan Lewis calls it unanswered spiritual longings. Maybe you want a less spiritually laden term, but we all know that ache we sometimes feel when we are inadequate to the needs of the world and we don't live up to our moral conscience. What we do when we feel that we're standing on the shore looking at the multitudes of people sinking and drowning. How do we deal with that pain? There are a lot of ways, and now I want to go into some of what I consider the rationalistic ways to deal with this pain. I admit I use some of these now and then. I think we all do. I mean, less rational, but just more immediate, is avoiding or anesthetizing ourselves. I mean, there are lots of distractions. We have our television, our music, our Facebook. We can submerge ourselves in hedonistic pleasures. with medication or alcohol or other drugs. None of this is new. It's all part of many of our lives. In the 1876 founding address, Adler speaks of this. He talks about the salons and the bazaars of fashion and festive halls in which we wander, chewing artificial phrases. He notes how often we succumb to the stale and insipid perfume and the brief exhilaration of dance, the physical stimulus of wine or food, the nervous excitement of games. Well, perhaps a less hedonistic and more praiseworthy method to avoid suffering is to just be so busy that we avoid it. We float above it, to lose oneself in the affairs of the world. In Adler's book, The Religion of Duty, he describes how easy it is, quote, to forget suffering by immersing oneself in business, public affairs, or charity. You can even avoid the suffering by immersing yourself in charity. That's interesting, right? But for those of us who refuse to avail ourselves of anesthetics or distractions of a busy life, there are very few of us, not me, but for those who want a more studied approach, you could turn to Aristotle or Plato or Kant. There's some philosophical ways to avoid suffering. Martha Nussbaum talks about Plato helping us avoid suffering by looking to the realm of the forms, eternal principles that are forever true and just, and looking at human limitations as simply something to overcome through reason. A classics professor, Patrick O'Sullivan, talks about Plato's approach as advocating a complete self-sufficiency devoted to a more abstract but permanent form of truth, which is, quote, independent of human relations and the vicissitudes of life. Nussbaum describes this as goodness without fragility. I wonder whether there really is such a thing. This approach to suffering is carried on by later rationalists, especially the philosopher that Adler liked the most, Immanuel Kant, who you heard about last week. Kant offered a powerful way to avoid pain, or at least to rationalize one's way through it. He attempted to make ethical contradiction impossible. Through dedication to reason, followers of Kant could deduce the best moral path in any situation based on principle. And his influence is evident in the very widely praised work of Lawrence Kohlberg. Now, Kohlberg claimed that moral development involved moving past merely acting out of social or emotional motives and learning to guide our behavior through universal moral principles. Ethical maturity, according to Kohlberg and other Kantians, is about acting based on reason. And there's no need for hand-wringing or anguish about choice because reason points the way. And once you figure it out, you don't worry anymore. Aaron Moss, who wrote an article called Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People, talks about this aspect in describing a hospital visit. He says, imagine that you're in the hallway of a hospital and you hear these screams of a woman, and you're in deep anguish and anxiety due to these screams. But then somebody explains to you that she's going through a normal labor, and your anxiety decreases. He uses this example to say that if we could make sense of innocent people suffering, if we could rationalize tragedy, then we could live with it. We would be able to hear the cry of sweet children in pain and not be horrified. We would tolerate seeing broken hearts and shattered lives, for we would be able to neatly explain them away. Our question would be answered and we could move on. Now, I find that description a bit creepy. I find it creepy, and it reminds me of the work of Philip Haley, who wrote a wonderful book called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. Haley tried to understand goodness by searching for it in the heart of cruelty, in the Holocaust. He was a researcher who was trying to understand how otherwise normal Germans, faithful spouses, loving fathers, dedicated doctors, could willingly torture Jewish children, gypsy children, with these ridiculous medical experiments. While researching this, Haley had to distance himself from the horror he was reading about. He bracketed his subjective emotional response, perhaps as much out of psychological need as out of best practices, right? He was protecting himself. Then it hit him. This is what happened to the Nazi doctors. Like them, he shielded himself against the emotional toll his work was taking by treating, quote, the slow crushing and grinding of a human being by other human beings as just part of his job. He understood more clearly how Nazi doctors and he himself could, quote, look upon torture and death without a shudder. He said, reading about the damned, I was damned myself, as damned as the murderers. There's a related philosophical escape through philosophy, which is Stoicism. This is related to this passage I just read. It was developed by the philosopher Zeno, and it taught that the good and wise wish to live in harmony with reality, the order of the universe, as revealed through divine reason. And if you can grasp the logos, the big picture, you can understand suffering as simply being a part of life. And in the context of an infinite and orderly cosmos, our own petty pain and even the sufferings of others means very little. All is dwarfed by a vast universe beyond our control, and we can drift above it once we accept it. Drift above the fray, calm and content. Adler did not want to drift above the fray. I mean, there are times where he uses some of the hard-edged rationalism of Kant to make sense, but he does not avoid suffering. In his book, Life and Destiny, he writes, let the Stoics say what they will. So long as we remain human, we shall always open our breasts to those warm loves that make the sweetness of existence, if only they make its bitterest pain. I want to turn to now ways not to avoid fragility, but how we can accept it and transform it. I learned a lot from Jane Addams. She was a brilliant intellectual, often overlooked for that by the Academy. And like her friend Felix Adler, she leapt into the fray, literally into the streets of Chicago through her settlement house, to work to relieve the suffering of many. She did not numb herself to that tragedy. As a child, in fact, she resented the adults that were trying to shelter children from the pain of life. Young people resent being patronized too as unable to confront life's pain. Even children, she said, quote, wish to climb steep stairs and eat their bread with tears. The bitterest pain of daily life is part of the sweetness of existence for her. In the Fragility of Goodness, Nussbaum supports this openness to suffering by drawing lessons from some Greek tragedies. Antigone, who was the niece of King Creon, goes through tragedy when her two brothers fight over whether to be loyal to King Creon, and they both die in that battle. And King Creon says, we will bury the loyal nephew with pomp and circumstance, but he outlaws burying the treasonous son. But Antigone, out of family loyalty, buries her brother, the traitor. And as a result, King Creon sentences her to death. He places the value of the state and law over the familial ties. But he doesn't avoid the suffering. King Creon says, behold me, what I suffer, because I have upheld what is high. Now we can criticize his choice, but he doesn't avoid the suffering. And Nussbaum points out that often we have conflicting loyalties in life. Maybe it's between family and loyalty to the state. But you can't always avoid this pain. In another Greek tragedy, Hecuba, a defeated but noble queen, gives money to a friend to take her son away so he could be starting a new life elsewhere, away from the enemies who defeated her. And then when she's walking along the beach and she sees her son's body washed up on the shore, she suddenly realizes that her friend killed her son, threw him overboard, and took the money for himself. Having lost her city, and now having lost her son, she's broken. She's defeated. She trusted. If we could turn back the time in those two examples, maybe we could tell Creon or Hecuba to think through their decisions to avoid the pain. Or maybe we could tell them to just start drinking. There are ways to avoid this pain. But Nussbaum points out that the tragedies teach us that in life, there are times where our values will clash. Maybe in a less dramatic and deadly fashion for you and me, thank goodness. But there are times where you have to choose between family and jobs. Do I go to my son's play or do I go to an important meeting? And you can't always avoid the pain that that choice takes. There's not necessarily a way to escape that. And that's not a sign that there's something ethically wrong. It usually means that you're ethically open and aware. There are times that you have to trust people, and that trust can be broken. And it's all part and parcel of being a human being of flesh and blood. This is a reality that no philosophy can reason away. Many people, Nussbaum say, talk about goodness as a gem, like a ruby or a diamond, a beautiful and durable rock that lasts forever. But she says that that's not the nature of goodness. She says goodness is beautiful, yes, but the beauty is wrapped up in its fragility. She suggests that it's less like a gem and more like a flower. That reality is more appropriate to the complexities of trying to live a good life. It's delicate. It can be crushed. Nussbaum rejects rationalistic escapes. Reason can certainly guide you. We can use Kant to help us live a good life, absolutely. But it does not fully explain goodness and relationships and human psychology, and that you can make use of what's been called recently the ethics of care. Now, one of the earliest philosophical proponents for this was Joan Tronto, who wrote the book of that name, and she emphasizes some characteristics important in ethical thinking. One is attentiveness, which is simply the recognition of the needs of others. And this is more of an emotional intelligence than a rational observation. A second is responsibility, which she says is simply the willingness to try to make the situation better. And it's not really acquiescing to obligation. It's more a choice to act, not just succumbing to cultural norms and roles. Caring can be a felt connection to others. And Jane Addams actively pursued this and the knowledge of others, but a deep connection to others. It's unacceptable and unethical and less rewarding for Jane Addams to quote, "If we grow contemptuous of our fellows and consciously limit our intercourse to certain kinds of people for whom we have previously decided to respect, we not only tremendously circumscribe our range of life, but limit our scope of ethics." So the spiritual and ethical suffering was a teacher for Addams, as it was for the Buddha. I mean, when the Buddha goes out in life and tries to find the meaning of life, what he really just sees is suffering is all around us. And he could escape that in many ways, and some Buddhists do escape it through going into a monastery, away from all suffering. But bodhisattvas who immerse themselves in the society are open to the suffering. For those of us physically relatively comfortable, having eyes wide open in a world full of pain can lead to a learning through suffering. You can learn to eat your bread with tears and stay strong. Sometimes to rationalize away the suffering, as did some Nazi doctors, doesn't make you a strong human being. It can turn you into a monster. That brings me to my final point that I want to make today, which is what ties all of this together with ethical culture. And it's about our approach to ethics. We don't restrict ethics to some rationalized philosophy. We don't even restrict it just to having a compassionate heart. For us, it's about a deeper relationship, a unique relationship with others that involves action. It's not just our head and our heart, it's also our hands. In confronting the question of why do bad things happen to good people, Aaron Moss insists that simply giving an answer, whether it's favored by Plato or Kant, is insufficient. In fact, ethics requires that we keep that question alive, not simply answer it and move on. He writes, as long as the pain of innocence remain a burning question, we are bothered by its existence. As long as we can't explain pain, we must alleviate it. If innocent people suffering does not fit into our worldview, we must eradicate it. Rather than justifying their pain, we need to get rid of it. Too often, comfortable human beings like me avoid or rationalize the suffering of others. Theists will say it's all part of God's plan. Hedonists can avoid it and take another shot. But humanism demands that we face up to the pain, to act to comfort and empower others. Not to revel in some guilt, not to gnash and writhe. Austin Klein, in the Philosophy of Religion and Humanism, says, humanism rejects the idea that we must wait for others or for some immaterial future. Instead, the fight against human suffering and evil must occur here and now. Humanism doesn't allow spiritual pain to remain only a negative and untransformed and corrosive force in our lives. It's for us to transform the sight of the multitudes who are drowning and reaching forward so that it doesn't paralyze us. Joan Lewis said, one of the goals of humanism may be to create an environment in which making such choices doesn't require such deep existential suffering in order to motivate us to act. Maybe we have to act before that, naturally, out of habit, and we need to teach each other how to do this. It might be as simple as what Adler said in the last words of his chapter, An Ethical Attitude Towards Suffering. There he offered an obvious path to accepting and then transforming the fragility of goodness. He says, suffering is a passive state. The cure of suffering is action. We have to act to minimize the suffering of the unfortunate many by transforming spiritual pain or aching conscience of those more fortunate like you and me into action. And the time is now. The task is ours. Thank you very much.